for coming here. I sometimes have meetings.
It's run by an artist, so you have to go there for 90 minutes or the plane $250 track. But it's like a just without no memorial. And like, there's a point where you're gonna what's that like,
I know what this one's about now. I can just It's honestly not the one I'm most excited about, but I'm like, I think I can actually play it.
now it's about
What, are you doing more drawings or?
I'm doing I started like right
There's a welding orientation.
I'm going on Monday.
Oh, okay.
I scheduled the one on Monday.
Okay.
But then I'm ready to do this. I'm sure if I can come in on Monday and show me some stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Keep saying. It is. I think the induction here is they're about to get that up and I think the welding company is ready next week. So Nick is already reading up for that. I don't know if he's done with it. I mean, I think we're all in the same spot. I think, I think they'd like to have this work, but everyone's in the same space, so it's all going to be okay. Yeah, me too. Same.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the piece I'm going to try and finish. I'm doing that, and then I just ordered some steel pestle. I want to make kind of like those like metal fences. I want to do like a little like wall pedestal for it, and then maybe like a banner hanging from a chain on it. I don't know. We'll see. Maybe a pillow. Pillows are fun to sew. I just did that one. She was gone for a few weeks, but she's back. I just did that. There is, yeah, but her requirement, Laura's requirement is that you can solve it. I mean, you probably yeah, I mean, you know, I was working on that. I was trying to make the glove part from scratch, and I could not get the patterns. I took a glove apart, like look at how they did it, and then I tried making where it's like a test one out of canvas, and I could not get the pieces that would fit, and I couldn't figure out how to pin it. So I was just like, this is gonna take me 2 months to figure this out. So I'm starting with a pre-made glove and just doing like applique on top of it. I need to finish. I'm like, let's have some steps out. Be less ambitious. That Cafe Busso, he was like very like appetizing color. They have some of those, and that part in the hallway is for students. Yeah, so there's huge plates there, but they're not going to refill it. So, yeah, some people already put their name on it. Yeah. Yeah.
Excuse me. I need to get to the camera. Just real quick.
I just ordered some off McMaster. They're shipping. Yeah, McMaster's yeah. Thank you. It's actually nice. Because I was looking for this because they have like the TNT steel that's really expensive. Like you type in low carbon, there's not like basic steel, like stuff. This is what I would type in. And then pick different shades and you can click on them. Yeah. Right. But like if it says something like height tolerant or like tool steel, I would say it's probably that's going to be cheap.
We're good over there? Yeah. Great. Thanks for coming, and welcome to the Wattis. And I'm happy to see so many faces and friends and just members of the community, and just great to be here together. So, welcome. It's just been a great experience to finally have been able to share this exhibition, or the first part of this exhibition, with everyone here after a few years of research and preparation. And so it's just been a joy to have conversations with many of you and just to begin sharing this research. And to share some thoughts tonight, I really thought of, rather than, I won't really walk through the exhibition as much as I will share a little bit of a trajectory that it relates to the exhibition, but also moves beyond it and is a bit more general, that has inspired and informed my own thinking process behind the show. And I think afterwards we're happy to take questions. We have drinks available, so I just encourage people to just hang out and enjoy the evening together. So I'm going to start off by plugging the work of my brother-in-law. His name is Jose Berrio, and he's an illustrator and graphic designer from Colombia who now lives in New York. And so for those of you who might be looking for an illustrator, he's your guy. He's particularly good at making record covers. So if there's any musicians out there, I added his email there, just in case you need it. And I realize that this seems like starting off a talk with an ad or a message from my sponsor. But the real reason I bring up my brother-in-law is because I want to share a short video that he made during the pandemic, and that he posted on social media. So let me play it now. I have a lot to say about this video, and I'll play it a few times throughout this lecture. And while I'm a great admirer of the new music organization called Bang on Can, my brother-in-law's video was actually the true inspiration for the title of my lecture, even if he's mostly banging on jars and bottles and not on cans. But this little video, for me, manages to summarize so much about what has drawn me to art and to making a career as a curator of contemporary art. There's something in here about abstraction and a form of communication that takes place outside of language. There's something in here about multiplicity, about how multiplicity and individuality are always entangled and happening at the same time as each other, on top of each other. There's something in here about mark making and forms of inscription. There's something about misalignment as a form of alignment, or what the writer Fred Moten calls ensemble, where the force behind collectivity or sociality or politics is not a search for consensus, but a polyrhythmic coexistence of difference. There's something about the distinction that Trinh T. Minh Ha makes between speaking about, speaking for, and speaking nearby. There's something about the body and the heartbeat, something about skill and expertise, and something about joy. I love how this little video manages to take a simple object and make it a lot more complicated. So I'm going to try to talk about each of these ideas and how they relate to my own thinking about art, about exhibition making, and how they've informed my recent research on this exhibition. So I know that it seems like I want to talk about music, but I don't really. Or what I want to do is talk about music as a way to talk about art and politics. Or maybe a better way to put that is, I want to talk about art and politics by using a musical vocabulary. There's a famous line by the recently passed Jean-Luc Godard, where he says, "The problem is not to make political films, but to make films politically." Which is kind of what I mean when I say that I don't actually want to talk about music or about what art has to do with music. But I want to talk about art and politics musically. Music is a visceral thing that is very hard to talk about. Miles Davis once said, "I do not play jazz." And what he meant, I think, is that he plays something that invents its own vocabulary. A vocabulary that is shared only by those who don't need to know what to call it, or how to contain it within language, or even how to describe it. The internet doesn't seem to have figured out the proper credit for this particular quote. But as at least one of these people famously put it, talking about music is like dancing about architecture. I'm not a musician myself, or a music expert, or a music critic, though I do have some history in being involved with music in various ways and writing about music in books and magazines. But I can't really start off this talk without saying a few very general things about music, which I realize will have to involve some dancing about architecture. Here's one very general thing one could say about music. Music is processed by the body. Or perhaps it's best to say that it first passes through the body before it reaches the mind. And since music is often too much for the mind to handle, it needs to overflow back into the body and lead to things like tapping, rocking back and forth, and so on. music impacts the body. It implicates and enlists the body. Without being mediated by language or logic, music touches the body and makes it move. In that sense, music is less of a concept that needs decoding than a vibration that triggers other vibration, which then creates forms of pleasure, pain, or combinations of both. That's why music is often compared to sex. A few months ago, during a studio visit, the artist Hannah Black used a phrase that I'll borrow here. Can something be sex, but also text? Music is one of those things that can be both. It tickles the body and also the brain. It's ephemeral and intermittent, but also carries meaning that makes a lasting impact. Music cross-pollinates, not just between sounds, but between languages, traditions, histories, and forms of knowledge and subjectivity. It can embody an abstract feeling, but it can also give structure to an entire social order. Let's try another very general statement about music. Music is a collective activity. People make music with others and play music to others. We form groups, like bands, and members who each play distinct roles work together to form a conversation between equals, where each brings something different to the table. We gather, by the thousands sometimes, to stand together in crowded stadiums or clubs. Music plays a significant role in creating a sense of belonging to something larger. In that sense, music provides a useful framework, a vocabulary with which to talk about the political. Communities or social political dynamics are often described in terms of improvisations, compositions, or rhythms. One last one. Music can also be a private, domestic, and deeply personal experience, central to constructing a sense of personal identity or to satisfying a kind of basic need. We all recently witnessed a great example of music being both a private experience and a collective one at the same time, and which created a sense of belonging to a specific time and place. From the early days of the pandemic, and I can try to say more about why this represents something powerful, but I think everyone in this room has already felt the answer to that question somewhere in their body. Right before he died in 1992, the French Marxist philosopher and sociologist Henri Lefebvre developed a critique of capitalism, or of the body under capitalism, by attempting to understand the nature of rhythm. His book, Elements of Rhythm Analysis, was divided into biological, psychological, and social rhythms. Quote, everywhere where there is interaction between a place, a time, and an expenditure of energy, he wrote, there is rhythm. It's clear that when stretched past the narrow lens of music or musical structure, words like rhythm or score or tone can be applied to vast areas of study, from biology and engineering to politics and aesthetics. In 2012, the curator Natasha Ginwala organized an exhibition called the Museum of Rhythm. In it, she used rhythm as a way to imagine a museum where history itself, or a range of historical moments and voices, is given pitches, frequencies, and tempos. She argued that when history is conceived as a rhythm, it can be reorganized. Instead of a linear progression of winners and losers, it can become a polyrhythm of overlapping and colliding parallel stories that coexist with delays, repetitions, reversals, accidents, and other rhythmic characteristics. Perhaps even the complexities of colonial and post-colonial consciousness, both past and present, could be mobilized and disrupted by way of rhythmic coherences and incoherences. The human condition has always been a polyrhythmic experience of overlapping and coexisting differences. Most commonly, our approach has been to manage and often oppress those differences by developing organizing systems like governments, religions, or ideologies, always to the benefit of some and at the expense of others. The more abstract logic of rhythm might provide a model, even if only a metaphorical one, for organizing our societies differently. And to do that, I think we're going to need to watch Jose's video. One of the things that's clear is that consensus is not the goal. Jose doesn't begin with all the rhythms being different and then gradually work towards making them increasingly similar or more aligned with each other. No, the strength of the performance comes from precisely how each component is not like any of the others, and yet wants to coexist with them. The structure of polyrhythms embodies the paradox that contradiction and disagreement can form the basis of a productive relationship, which strikes me as particularly resonant in our current climate. If socio-political forces once strive towards sameness, towards consensus, towards a utopia of a colorblind society where everyone can be the same, I think we're now recognizing that what's so important about our communities is difference. We need to more forcefully recognize and celebrate not how similar we are, but how different. I already mentioned the writer Fred Moten, who's a great example of someone who talks about music as a way to say something about art, about politics, about race, about philosophy. And he doesn't just use musical vocabulary, but he writes musically. He writes theory in the key of free jazz, which is not to say that he theorizes free jazz, but that he theorizes in concepts that have a specific rhythm to them, where a particular syncopation and beat connects one sentence or word or idea to the next one. I'll borrow a phrase he uses to describe Cecil Taylor and say that Moten himself is a writer who communicates on frequencies outside and beneath the range of reading. In a conversation with the artist Wu Tsang, he said that all we are instruments. And so it makes sense that his own writing performs the blur and the beat that he is writing about. Or in his own words, the beat becomes the buzz. But I want to pause for a moment on what Moten does with the word ensemble, because he pushes that word the way that a horn player pushes the bend of an A or an F. I imagine we all know what an ensemble is. It's a band. If a band has a fixed group of members, an ensemble usually has a changing cast of characters who still form a cohesive unit. What I find so useful with Moten is how he transformed the word from a noun into a condition. His ensemble is not a group of people, but a state of improvisation, of generative and collective becoming, of thinking without a center and beyond singularity or totality. Ensemble, for Moten, is undoing the ability to locate. It's not a point of intersection, but a potentiality where spaces between identities overlap but are not bridged. ensemble cuts and refuses to close. An ensemble refers not to a specific situation, but to the totality of an ecosystem, to everything that is generated by a situation, everything that emerges from it, everything that is tangled within it, and everything that works to oppose or contradict it as well. And to transform the word a little bit more and to stretch it until it becomes a verb would give us the ability to ensemble. What would it mean to ensemble a shape, an image, a body, or even an entire community? To ensemble a law, to ensemble a museum, to ensemble an exhibition. It wouldn't mean to complete or to bridge or even to harmonize, but it would refer to something messier and more unruly, something harder to contain, like an augmentation or a multiplication via an act of improvisational structure. To ensemble is to deal in intensities and is perhaps best measured in decibels, not language. One way to think about art is not to talk about what it is, but to ask what it does. And so what if art is a way to ensemble? For years, I've thought that what art really does well is to complicate. It takes something from the world and complicates it. An artwork can take something as simple as a square, an apple, a color, a box, or a face, things we've seen a million times and think we know everything about, and recomplicate them to make them into something we need to decipher all over again. An artwork inserts a lap, or a void, or a trap into the fabric of the known, and creates the necessity to fill that void with knowledge or meaning. To do that, we might need things like language, like taste, like politics, like history, like ethics, but each of those are separate from art. They are decomplication tools, or mechanisms we use to organize knowledge and make sense out of the sensible. The artistic act, at least in my view, is the one that causes the initial complication, that tears the whole or ties the knot, and that triggers the need for all those many other mechanisms to be set into motion. Obviously, many artists are like good criminals who know what will be triggered as soon as the crime is committed, who know what the police's playbook is going to be, and so they embed those mechanisms into the nature of the art book. So maybe they don't complicate as much as they ensemble. Artists and writers have long used a musical vocabulary to talk about art. The artist David Hammond says, "I'm trying to make abstract art out of my experience, just like the loneliest monk." A painting is described in terms of its tone, its rhythm, its notes. Exhibitions have a tempo, a cadence, a beat. Personally, when I curate an exhibition, my goal is not to make a point or to illustrate a theme, but to create a mood, a temperature, a vibration, maybe even some kind of music. When I sit down to write an essay about art, I start off by thinking about the key I want to write it in. When I move on to a new job, I think of an institution as a place that has specific instruments that can be used to interpret and perform a score. I really like the metaphor of a score. When writing a score, a composer is making music, but is also giving music. By definition, a score is for others. As a set of prompts, guidelines, or instructions, a score comes alive when it's read and interpreted, and as such, it's a language that begets other languages. It doesn't tell people what to think as much as it asks to be transformed into something else. It's a way to provide direction in the form of a question. For me, an institution's mission statement can be understood as a type of a score. Rather than heavy-handed rhetoric of big claims and big promises, I prefer a mission statement that doesn't prescribe or predetermine what an institution will do, what its program will consist of, what forms it wants to take, or what audience it wants to reach. Instead, when conceived as a score, a mission statement can allow for different interpretations to flow in and out, so that the institution itself remains in a state of performance. One of my favorite mission statements was once used by the Drawing Center in New York, which was, what is drawing? When framed as a question in this way, I felt like it took on the properties of a score, because it provided a direction and a specificity, but it allowed its value to come from how it's interpreted and performed. Different people, at different moments in history, will answer this question in different ways, leading to a different program that engages different audiences. And yet, this constantly changing flow emerges from an unchanging and consistent mission, providing stability, clarity, and purpose to the organization. Just as the performance of a score will sound differently depending on who interprets it, what instruments they use to interpret it, or even what the acoustics of the room are, the answer to the question, what is drawing, will change as the institution's leadership and curatorial voices change, as the local, national, and international dialogue around art changes, as political realities change, or as the city around it changes. As a result, an institution stays alive, always in the process of reinterpreting and reimagining itself. I should say that inspired by this, we wrote a mission statement for the Wattis some years ago that also takes the form of the question, which is what can we learn from artists today? My hope is that this establish a core priority of centering artists, learning from artists, following the lead of artists, foregrounding the artist perspective, and fostering a public forum for a community to learn and benefit from it. But whether this happens via exhibitions, or via publishing, or via performances, or by doing none of those things, but something else entirely, that's all up for grabs. It will depend on who interprets the score, the instruments, the key, and the tempo they choose to do it with, and the cultural context with which it's performed, and the acoustics of the room, so to speak. A few years ago, I submitted a proposal to curate a major international biennial. It wasn't well received. Here's what I said. Each venue of the biennial would be an interpretation of a graphic score. While traditional scores tell a performer to play one note followed by another note, graphic scores involve shapes that performers interpret together. In a sense, I was proposing that a mission or concept statement not take the form of a sentence, or even appear as written language, but be simply a graphic score, where each color and shape could refer to a different type of artwork or activity, and where works on view appeared and reappeared within exhibitions, publications, lectures, performances, and so on, always looking and sounding a bit different. My hope was to replace a curatorial agenda or theme with what I referred to earlier, to give a biennial a mood, a temperature, a vibration, maybe even some kind of music. I didn't even get to the interview stage. So today I'd like to try again. I want to try and propose a score for an exhibition, and then narrate how I might interpret that score and conceive of an exhibition. So this time, my score will not be one of these, but will be something that I think you're already a little bit familiar with. So if that is our score, what is the exhibition? It's an exhibition, as you all know, called Drum Listens to Heart, one part of which you've seen today. I've already shared some of the thinking that's gone into it, but I'm going to finish by talking through some of the specific ideas that gave shape to this show. I should also say that what initially inspired this show was not seeing Jose's video, but was actually, it started with a year-long collaborative research project that we did here in 2016 and 17 around the work of the artist David Hammonds, whose work has also come up a few times already, much like Jose's video had. But going back to Jose's video, one of the things that I see in that video, here it is that it's not just about music or about rhythm, like Guinuala's Museum of Rhythm, but it relates more specifically to percussion. So Drum Listens to Heart takes percussion as its point of departure. Or perhaps it's better to use the adjective form, the percussive, and say that the show tries to imagine the artistic and the political through the lens of the percussive. The drumming or percussion occupies a central place in the history of humanity and has appeared in cultural traditions all around the world for not hundreds, but for thousands of years. It's reasonable to imagine that music itself began with early humans mimicking and externalizing their own heartbeat, tapping it out with their hands or feet. It's incredibly basic and foundational to the human story. But even if every body has a pulse and all share that in common, there are countless ways that bodies might express that pulse, countless reasons it might choose to do so, and countless structures that govern how they do so. What I mean is that while percussion refers to a particular musical sound or musical activity, it also refers to a wide range of forms and systems far beyond the realm of music. So this exhibition is not about music and about percussion, as much as it uses percussion as a way to think about art and politics from a wide range of perspectives. It uses a visitor's familiarity with drumming as an entry point, but then quickly makes it clear that they are being challenged to think about the percussive in much broader terms than that. I might even say that this exhibition tries to complicate percussion. One well-known and relevant historical fact is that slave owners outlawed the use of a drum. When I was writing my essay about David Hammons, I came across a quote by the painter Jack Whitten, who explained how music became so central to Black American life by saying, quote, "When my white slave masters discovered that my drum was a subversive instrument, they took it from me. The only instrument available was my body, so I used my skin. I clapped my hands, slapped my thighs, and stomped my feet in dynamic rhythms," end quote. At the time, I was relating this to how Hammons used his own body as a tool or instrument in his body prints. But what I also realized is that it pointed to something powerful about a politics of abstraction. It pointed to how something as abstract as a drum beat could create such a threat and be so potentially subversive so as to actually be outlawed. And it also showed how even a law can't stand in the way of percussion, since drumming doesn't require any special tools or technology, but is always available through one's own body. It made it very clear to me that drumming is involved with things far beyond the realm of music, and that percussion, or the percussive, engages aesthetic, expressive, and political forms more broadly. My sense was that percussion, or what the cultural theorist, historian John Mowat calls a percussive field, would create a context to talk about how abstraction and abstract languages can have a political bite or a political force. A musical vocabulary or musical metaphors are already being used to talk about a politics of liberation or emancipation, for example. But perhaps the specificity of percussion or the percussive could outlaw something a bit more precise about what the abstract has to do with the political. And since cultures all around the world have a connection to percussion, the project would bring together a diverse range of perspectives without being framed as being, quote, about that diversity. It could be polyrhythmic by creating polyrhythms rather than being about the polyrhythmic. In conceiving the exhibition, I immediately knew that if I wanted to complicate percussion and extend its reach beyond the realm of music, the works needed to avoid drums, drumming, or any representation of drums. And I say that with great admiration for the work of Henri Salah here, but I think that I could take as a given that all visitors would know what a drum is, what it looks like, how it works, and it was not something I needed to make visible in the exhibition itself. In fact, the show could push against an established familiarity with percussion as a way to suggest that any form of pre-existing knowledge, any existing familiarity or comfort zone, is always subject to challenge and ripe for revision, especially via the language of art. So instead of revolving around the drum or around music, the show revolves around two broader or more abstract ideas. On one hand, the percussive as something physical, but at the same time as something social or ideological. In terms of the physical, it's fairly obvious to say that a percussive gesture is one that involves a strike, an impact, or the making of some mark. Something like this painting by Lozano from 1963, which I like because it's not just a hammer strike, but it's a polyrhythmic strike with many moments of impact happening at once. Or this sculpture by Guadalupe, for example. Both of these works are immediately and physically percussive, even if neither of them makes any sound or involve a drum in any way. David Hammond's basketball prints also come to mind, since they are drawings made by striking paper with dirt using a basketball. Other works relate to the percussive repetitions of mechanical systems or the movements of an industrial assembly line. And it's easy to think about the percussive force of pistons or jackhammers as percussive instruments. In a rarely seen video by Hammond entitled Gone, which will be on view in the third part of the show, the artist is walking by a construction site on a city sidewalk with workers making all kinds of noise with their power tools. And instead of walking off or covering his ears, as many of us would do, he reappears with a gong and joins in, transforming the construction crew into the members of an improvised orchestra. He ensembles the sidewalk. Each of these works also point to how closely the physical nature of the percussive is rooted in the body. About 3 or 4 years ago, I was fortunate enough to spend an afternoon with the late percussionist Milford Graves in his house in Queens, where he told me about going to the source of things and about his search to understand the drum by studying the heart. About how all bodies are drums, each one playing at the speed of its own heart, and how all drums are bodies, each one made of a skin that vibrates differently. Music, he would say, is not abstract at all, but involves very concrete vibrations that make physical impact with the space around it, in much the same way as the beating of a heart makes a physical impact within the body that surrounds it. And so in order to understand the vibrations of the heart, Milford would hook people up to a kind of homemade EKG machine that would measure their heartbeat. And he would then process the recording through an algorithm, also invented and made by him, and would chart the data in a complex system of measurements. And then in his later years, he would make these incredible sculptures that bring together that sense of the scientific and the empirical, but also his deep interest in spirituality, ritual, and his deep knowledge of percussive traditions. It was when Milford passed away last year, or I don't know how many years ago, that I finally settled on a title for the exhibition, which is a phrase written on one of his sculptures, and gave me the way to dedicate this whole project to him. So the percussive contains the physicality and materiality of a strike or a blow, but also the vibration or a pulse. But as Milford's sculptures make clear, the percussive has its other foot in specific systems of belief, whether they be spiritual and ritualistic, or capitalist and mechanical in nature. This aspect of the percussive relates to its political and social force. One way to think about this is to think about control, or forms of control. The percussive can be a call to order, in the sense that a marching drum or a church bell controls and determines the way bodies move. Police batons are percussive instruments. So is a bomb. Behaviors and beliefs are drummed into people with relentless and forceful repetition. In a studio visit with the drummer Eli Kessler a few years ago, he said, "Mitch McConnell is the drummer. He keeps and sets the pace." In that sense, percussion enforces, polices, and authorizes. It demands consensus and obedience. You must march to the beat of the drum or else. A 2012 video by Francis Alice titled Guards, for example, gets at how a percussive military structure turns individuality into conformity, or turns a chaotic but emancipated polyrhythm into a single disciplined beat. But at the same time, the percussive is a force of liberation, emancipation, and healing, sometimes even a necessity for survival. Slave owners were afraid of the drum not only because slaves used it to communicate in code, but because it acted as a glue that strengthened a sense of community and collectivity, which would potentially empower a rebellion. In our present day, the percussive is central to protest movements and helps urban activists unite and cohere. And in a more metaphorical sense, it helps them collectively refuse to march to the beat of empire's drum by interrupting the beat, breaking free of it, and replacing it with another. In that sense, the percussive can threaten forms of authority and voice a powerful demand for freedom, and it can do so without uttering a single word, without a hashtag or a manifesto, but via abstraction. For Drum Listens to Heart, the artist and choreographer NIC Kay is making a new multi-channel piece about the percussive and movement traditions across the African diaspora related to forms of liberation. Because all things percussive, the body is always involved and dance is central. In the context of a techno rave, percussion can lead bodies to reach a euphoric trance. And in the context of a sacred ritual, the drums are the means through which to access the spirits and to achieve an exalted state. I'm grateful to the artist Trisha Donnelly, who sent me a copy of Maya Daren's The Divine Horseman. And I look forward to reading the DeForest Brown Jr.'s Assembling of Black Counterculture, which just came out a few months ago, as it promises a history of techno with a focus on Black experiences in industrialized labor systems. And healing is closely connected to percussion in a wide range of cultures as well. Not only is it in the context of spiritual rituals, but also with regards to the healing power of vibration and the practice of sound baths. These extraordinary sculptures by Guadalupe Maravilla, which he calls healing machines or disease throwers, refer to his own personal journey surviving cancer and are made by using objects he collected along his path as an undocumented migrant traveling to the US from El Salvador. And these elaborate installations by Mkal Ngakpa from Cameroon involve water dripping onto various resident surfaces, triggering different types of deep generators, and a recreation of rituals formed by people fleeing state violence by finding safety and community in nearby caves. Drum Listens to Heart weaves all of these different forms of percussion together. The physical and the socio-political, the literal and the metaphorical, and brings together and juxtaposes instances of physical impact and vibration with forms of control, emancipation, and community building. My colleague Diego Villalobos, who's been my close conversation partner and collaborator at the Wattis on this project and who's curated the performance program that accompanies it, describes this research as relating to the question of who is doing the drumming and who is being drummed. And it's true that a beat cuts in different ways. A beat is a part of a song that inspires the body to come alive, but it's also an act of physical violence that forces another body to collapse. To some, the drum is the peaceful and restorative heartbeat of Mother Earth, while to others, it signals an urgent call to war. And in a moment when historical narratives are being renegotiated to bring forth voices that have been subject to colonial erasure and systemic racism, this exhibition turns to a form of expression, communication, celebration, and protest that marginalized voices have long used to be heard and seen. So in the end, I wonder if the percussive can be a way to ensemble. Can it be a political model where diverging perspectives don't agree, disagree, or even work towards a consensus, but where they gather, coexist, listen to each other, make something with each other, and mutually adapt to a context as it evolves, like a polyrhythmic ensemble? Could the percussive provide an emancipatory model rooted in the body, where the abstractions of rhythm have political agency? Can the percussive form a basis for a vibrating and invisible undercurrent, where difference is mobilized and energized in ensemble rather than resolved? Can the percussive cut into the beat and insert another one in the break, and thereby dislodge or trouble the rhythms of a dominant marching order? Can the percussive generate an aesthetic and expressive language of beats, pulses, tones, and tempos that binds materials and forms to each other in new ways, or that informs new ways people can relate to the world, and to each other. To percuss is to vibrate. Sometimes those vibrations simply tickle us, causing a chuckle or a gasp, and provide access to a liberating space outside of reason, intention, and purpose. Other times, those vibrations are strong enough to shake the world, changing it forever. I think I'll end here, although there's a lot more to say. As a physical exhibition, Drum Listens to Heart is divided into 3 consecutive chapters, or rhythms, each of which is presented for 6 weeks, which means that visitors only ever encounter a fragment of the exhibition. They walk in the middle of the song, only a few of its many beats at a time. Like a heartbeat, the exhibition stays alive by always staying in motion. There is an ambitious live music performance series, there's a pop-up record store, there's a catalog that includes text by a range of writers. So as a whole, Drum Listens to Heart is structured like a polyrhythm, with 3 chapters of physical works, the live performances, the catalog, the shop, all operating together to create distinct yet overlapping rhythms. And once the entire show has been produced and you see it, you like it, you dislike it, and perhaps create other exhibitions or artworks or essays in the future that are informed by it in some way, then it might have a chance of becoming not just a polyrhythm, but an ensemble. Okay, I think everyone expects me to play Jose's video one last time, so I'm not going to do that. And instead, I'm going to leave you with the only account that I think is worth following on Instagram. Jose told me about it. It's called Dust Digital. Oh, that didn't work. Questions, or we can just have drinks. Anyone have any questions?
How does the percussive figure into the relationship between the different actual installation?
Of the 3 different exhibitions? it became clear early on that rather than, part one should explore this aspect of it, part two should explore this other, that's not the way we approached it. We tried to make each of them somehow touch on a little bit of all, to entangle and mix a little bit of all these different notes all these different directions we're trying to take percussion towards vibration, towards impact, towards the heart, towards spirituality, towards community building. And so we try to do that with each of the chapters. So they all, because at the end of the day, there's also on a very basic visitor experience level, we're very aware that every exhibition needs to operate as a standalone in addition to being part of this longer trajectory. People in this room might see the whole thing, but I think a lot of people in the audience are only going to see one thing, right? In the catalog, though, for example, because the catalog is not a show, we don't even make reference to the fact that the show is cut up and free. The catalog doesn't even ever say that. It's just, here's a show with a group of artists, and it just doesn't even, because that's not really relevant to the catalog. It only is something that is trying to be worked out with the language of exhibition. Yeah.
Have you found Fred Moten's work to be inspiring in other cases too?
In other cases?
Yeah, beyond this exhibition.
Beyond this exhibition?
Yeah.
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, to me, it really being something that among many, I extracted it in this particular talk. It actually was really useful to me because it led me to a bunch of other people, which I found to be really useful. And when the book comes out next month, the essay that I wrote really goes, yes, has Moten in it, but really moves past that. But yeah, Moten is are you familiar with his writing? There's something very basic about also how, music is so central, it flows through every sentence of how he writes, so it became a really interesting example of someone like Hammonds, who is not a musician and doesn't write with music as the topic, but somehow writes with music as the form. Yeah, to me it was really useful. I mean, music in general is something that I have an interest in beyond this show, so I think part of this is drawing on just a long-standing interest in people who kind of are invested in the vocabulary that is connected to music as a way to deal with doing things that are not related to music. Like, I don't work in the field of music, and yet I'm interested in how it can inform how one might work in the field of contemporary art curating, for example. But that score proposal clearly did not work at all. Yeah.
I'm actually interested in hearing more about it. So obviously, I'm guessing the show was inspired by that proposal?
No, not really, because that proposal was just, it was a little bit of a silly move. I literally just when you're expected to write this long-winded justification of why your proposal is the best proposal ever, I literally sent that. Yeah, I just said here as a score. The show will be, these different aspects of the show will interpret these scores. Basically, I didn't really have all that much more in it than that. Because I was interested in, I just was interested in having, and as one way that there is a specificity to those scores. They look like this and not look like that, right? They're recognizable as something, but language is not their support mechanism that allows us to draw meaning from them. There's something else that we need to draw meaning from them, which might be different for different people or different, but language was, I wanted to really kind of de-center language as a way to engage with art.
I'm thinking about, this is very open-ended, but I'm thinking about high tap versus low tap. And when you talked about how using the body as a drum, the skin as a drum, as an alternative to the actual technology of the drum. I'm thinking about that aspect of your talk, and I'm also thinking about the sculptures that are very bodily and medical and scientific that are near the front door. And so I don't have a very specific question, but could you respond to that high tap, low tap distinction between the heart as the most basic drum, and then something like techno, which involves more
machine. Yeah, I mean, I think that's super interesting. I mean, the Michael E. Smith piece here, it kind of brings that together, I think, in a way, because on one hand, it's giving an inanimate object a heartbeat, right? Giving it a pulse by projecting this laser thing on it. But then, of course, it's a very cold, heartless, mechanical device that looks more like a target, you know, targeting its prey than it does necessarily. I mean, it's both, right? So it's both the kind of basic, natural form of a heart that a heart is, as well as the kind of clinical, cold, mechanical structure that a machine that a machine is and what it does to the body.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you went about like curating the artists, just what you were talking about right now, how like the activating of it, it makes me think a lot of like NIC Kay's like soundscapes, how like when they're embodied, they're like this living, moving being, and then when they're just like displayed, they're just like this object.
Right.
Yeah, so I was just wondering sort of like how you went about finding these pieces.
I mean, the Nick. So I don't know if people heard that you referred to NIC Kay, sculptor, makes these kind of incredible, huge body wearable sculptures. And yeah, I mean that's a you know, for me too. Those I think are kind of incredible objects in and of themselves in a way, even when you don't wear them. Just as a side note, I know it's not answering your question, but that notion of a wearable is something that is going to come into play where the artist Hei Yang in the third part, the pieces that she's giving us are wearables. There are these scarves and bracelets of these various bells that are meant to be worn by visitors in such a way that the visitors become the drums of the show, right? It's the visitors walking around the gallery become the percussive instruments of the show itself. But so engaging the body as a percussive instrument in that way was also something we explicitly wanted to bring into the pool, so we're doing that later in January. But you know, why and how these particular artists, Diego can answer that question. We spent a lot of time looking at a lot of things, and you know, there's always some core things that were central from the beginning. Some of which then, interestingly, as in the case of all shows, you start clearly with a particular artist playing a central role, and that artist actually completely falls out of the final checklist. But you know, it's something that you want to hit different notes. It was particularly challenging because we had this list of artworks, and then they needed to make sense together, and then not only that, but they needed to make 3 different types of sense together, and these 3 different isolated things that you wouldn't see at the same time. And so it was a little bit of a 3D puzzle. And then there's obviously the logistics of which ones have sound and which ones need darkness and blah, blah, blah. The second chapter, is, I think I mentioned, is all video, 100% video, for example, which will be it was important that the 3 parts feel very different. You know, if a song has 3 sections to it, then you want it to go somewhere. So the second chapter needs to take what you guys have seen, take it somewhere. We need to kind of bend the note or change the rhythm. So we're definitely doing that the next time. Yeah.
Just a little comment. The Lozano one and the Barry Laval one are like, I think when I first saw the show, the Lozano painting really was the most surprising because it was like trying to have the sense of seeing an impact fill in the absence of sound in some way, in terms of like the decision to put that up to like represent it's just in terms of trying to project the drum or the impact and then the cracked glass in the same way.
Yeah.
With the absence of it, or you imagining the moment of the sound where that work you are hearing that painting in a different way in the context of the show.
Right.
I think. And that was the most surprising for me in terms of the decision, like for what work.
It's interesting that you put it by hearing, because I mean, for me, those 2 works are there to try to pulled drum percussion away from even hearing as the word you would use to describe a drum at all, or to describe percussion. That to try to point to that percussion, yes, involves sound. We think of that involved, but percussion also just is an active impact, and so that's what those two, rather than sound, or in addition to sound. So I see it less as like these are instead, or these are meant to have a viewer imagine the sound of that, more so than, in the context of the show around percussion, to kind of try to kind of parse out when you talk about a percussive gesture, what are you saying? Yes, you're saying that a percussive gesture generates a particular kind of sound, yes, you're saying, but also you're saying a percussive gesture involves an act of striking and hitting, and that's kind of what these two try to do.
Yeah, they're real loud, that's real loud.
It's loud, yeah. Yeah. And for me, this was an really early one that survived staying on the checklist for years, actually. And has always been very central to this project for reasons that it's just such basic, I get, again, for me, the heart is such a basic part of the human story. The hammer is the most basic part of the human story of technology. There's something about a hammer as a drum that is just like, you can't get more basic than that, or a hammer as an impact tool or a strike tool. And I loved how this one kind of diverted that to a magically polyrhythmic hammer in some way, because polyrhythm and the kind of grammar of the polyrhythmic was so important to the show. And so here we have a kind of polyrhythmic hammer.
I'm hung up on the Mark Twain quote, which I've always found funny, no matter how it's.
Oh, the dancing of it, right?
Sure. I don't know. I'd just be interested to hear
This?
your thoughts as somebody whose instrument is to choose objects, but then also to communicate using language. Like that's really a go-to tool, right? It's like, is it funny or does it feel pithy because of the second part, like dancing about architecture, like you say golfing about architecture, you could say dancing about I don't know, biochemistry, like. Is it just actually an absurd thing?
I think it's just that's how I take it.
Or the first half, though, it kind of sounds like it's just saying writing is fucking hard. Like,
right.
About anything.
Right, about anything.
Like,
I guess I take this as specifically about music, trying to do something about, something about music. That's how I interpret it.
That's kind of how I've always encountered it. And
yeah.
Like, totally, you just gotta feel the vibe.
Or something, yeah.
But the more I think about it, maybe that's why it's so hard to attribute.
Right.
It's just, it feels like you could use it to
mean anything.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know, but maybe it does work better.
Yeah, I just use it as a caveat to say, like, I'm going to say some things about music, but like keep in mind that like
it's
I'm just not really possible to say anything about music. Yeah.
I think the best contradiction to that might be Ralph Gleason when he wrote the liner notes for Pitches Brew.
What did he say?
He just put it out in a way, nothing like that had ever come up, and he was reaching it as one of the best jazz critics of the day. It's very poetic, it's all lowercase, punctuation's random. It's just a really, way of translating something that can be translated into words.
Right. Yeah.
I'm going to butcher it, but it's something that quotes that sort of flips this. The architect, whose name I forget, who designed the original Penn Station, which no longer exists in New York City, a critic described the architecture as frozen music. So it's yin-yang.
Right. There's the flip side of that. Yeah. But I feel like that's a way to describe good architecture or something. Like that's a qualifier for architecture to make it talk about how successful it is. This feels like it's saying something about music that describes how impossible it is. Yeah. To wrap language to around.
I mean, the thing that I like about that quote is like, and this is kind of something that we've talked about, is that it's almost kind of like addresses the space in between. And again, if we're thinking about like rhythm, like there's this kind of like, it relies also on silences for it to
Yeah.
be cohesive and like structural.
Yeah.
So again, I kind of like think about like the distance between like the artwork and its meaning and who's, you know, on the receiving end. And that kind of like space in between that, to me, is like very like sacred.
Right.
And again, that kind of like goes back to the Lozano as well as the very limited, kind of like both of these kind of like, or almost like marking these beats and
Yeah.
really like working and playing with that silence.
Yeah. 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 Should we put some music on? We have a lot of music. I mean, how do we not put some music on? Let's put some music on, and please come have a drink and hang out, and thanks again for coming. Thank you.
I tried to